We're going to be in Luke chapter 7, verses 36 to 50 today. And I'm looking forward to today's message for a variety of reasons, but one of them is because the story that we're looking at today, especially if you're a skeptic or if you're kind of far from faith or you're not sure about Christianity, this is one of those texts that show you the beauty of Jesus, who he is, how good he is, without some of the things that sometimes it's hard to suspend our disbelief about. There's no kind of crazy supernatural healing. There's no angelic apparitions. It's just Jesus interacting with humanity, and it's a beautiful picture of who God is. And we've been talking about in this series, as we've been studying the stories of Jesus through the eyes of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, this simple fact that if you want to understand what God is like, that Jesus is the starting point. If you want to understand what God is like, then Jesus is the starting point. And as we look at the story that we're going to look at today, we're going to see Jesus be an incredible picture of the heart and the character and the nature of God. So let's jump in. Luke chapter 7, verse 36 starts this way. One of the Pharisees asked him, that's Jesus, to eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house and reclined at table. So let's stop there for a second. We're going to be introduced to two characters today. Jesus is going to interact with two people, and the first one is a Pharisee. His name is Simon, and Simon is somebody who I can kind of identify with in a lot of ways, someone who maybe you can identify with in a lot of ways as well. In fact, I think Simon in so many ways is reflective of what it means to be a person who lives in Lake Nona. Simon is a wealthy, upper middle class man. He's well educated. He's come from a pretty solid family background. He has some religious history. In fact, as a Pharisee, it means that he's one of the religious elites of his day. He's a part of a very small cadre of about 1,000 or a couple of thousand men like him across the entire nation of Israel. He works in vocational ministry. That's what he does as a job. I mean, this is Simon's gig, and he's an incredibly interesting and intriguing person because he decides to invite Jesus over to his house for a meal. And you might be thinking, okay, maybe Simon is different than the rest of the Pharisees, these religious elites that tend to have an argument and fight with Jesus all the time. He invited Jesus into his house. He must be a really nice guy, just trying to get to know who Jesus is. Well, in Luke chapter 6, Jesus ends up healing a man who has a withered hand on the Sabbath day, a holy day for the Pharisees. And it says there in Luke chapter 6 that immediately after that happened, the Pharisees conspired together to decide how they were going to murder Jesus. So in Luke chapter 7, this invitation to Jesus to have dinner is not about building a relationship. It's about building a case against him. They're looking for as much information as they can to make an indictment against this man to show that he is an enemy of the state. So Simon, the Pharisee, is a person who's a part of the story. And in the Near East, when you went to go to dinner, this was not like a quick stop at PDQ. It wasn't a quick, hour and 15-minute, lunch at Nona Blue where you get a black and blue burger, which is an incredible burger, by the way. It's not any of those things. It's pretty much an all evening event. I mean, you're talking about hour upon hour upon hour. They would recline, putting their feet away from the table. They would lean up on a shoulder like this, and they would sit there and talk for hours and hours and hours, and the food would come over the course of time. So Jesus is sitting down at this table, and he's about to have a meal that's going to take a few hours, and he knows that Simon's intention is not to be his friend. It is to catch him in some kind of lie so they can build a case against him as being an enemy of the state. And then in verse 37, we're introduced to the second character, somebody who I also identify with, and maybe you can identify with in some ways as well. And behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner. Now I want to stop there for a minute to help you understand what it is that Luke is saying. In Luke chapter 7, when he says a woman of the city, he's using a euphemism for a term that describes women that use their bodies and sell their bodies to be able to pay bills. And when we think about this role that this woman is playing, who she is, I find it so interesting that she doesn't have a name. And the reason why she doesn't have a name is because no one cares what her name is. In Luke chapter 8, when Luke interviews folks, he has names of women that are included in the scriptures and text. But for the people in this community, her name doesn't matter because her value does not exist. To be a prostitute during those days and times was a little bit different than even the way that it is now. It meant that a woman had most likely had her father leave her family, and as a result of that, either through death or through his choice of divorce, left women vulnerable with no other option by which they could be taking care of themselves. They could not own property. They could could not vote. There was nothing that they could do. The only asset they had was their body. And so they would end up in brothels and be used by men over and over and over again simply to pay bills. Everyone knows who this woman is. Everyone knows her situation and circumstance. And to humanize her a little bit, I want you to give this woman a face if you can. Give this woman a name if you can. I mean, she's the kind of woman that if you're married, you don't want her talking to your husband at the gym because she's gonna butter him up and let him know that she's available. If you're a man, this is a woman you do not want to see and be seen in public with because everyone's gonna assume the only reason you know her is because of the things that she does. And if you're a parent, this is the woman you don't want your son to grow up and meet, and it is not the person you want your daughter to become. She is on the lowest rung of cultural realities, and the only reason she's alive is because men in power have decided that they want to use her. And behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner, when she learned that Jesus was reclining at a table, brought an alabaster flask of ointment, and standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears and wiped them off with the hair of her head and kissed his feet and anointed them with the ointment. I wish I could paint a compelling enough picture for you of how absurd this idea would be. Jesus is sitting down having a meal with religious elites, holy men. There are no women in the room unless they are bringing a meal for the men to enjoy along this long, drawn out conversation. And in the midst of that moment, in that situation and circumstance, as they're reclining at the table, having religious conversation, talking about things that wealthy, religious, smart, educated, intellectual men talk about, this woman of the city walks into a home that is not hers, to a party she is not invited to, and the room goes quiet. Every eye, I believe it, every eye begins to drop to the ground because no man wants to think that the reason why that woman is here is because of them. No one wants to be associated with her. No one wants to know who she is. There is quiet in the room. You could hear a pin drop. And she is frantically searching as she enters into this space, probably with a degree of shame, probably with a degree of concern. She knows that she's not invited. Everyone wonders why in the world is she there. She meets Jesus' eyes. She goes over to Jesus. She sits behind him where his feet are. And as she realizes who she's next to, she breaks down in tears. She ugly cries. Have you ever ugly cried to the point where it's just nasty and ugly, you know? Like that nasty, nasty cry. The one that you don't want anyone to see. The one where there's snot coming out, there's water coming everywhere. I mean, it is a wreck. She begins to cry like that. And she begins to cover Jesus' feet with her tears and all the other nastiness that comes from ugly crying. And as she sits there, she takes this alabaster flask, she breaks it open, she pours oil out on Jesus' feet. The pungent smell would have overtook what was happening in the room. You could not smell the food anymore because the perfume was so powerful. And she begins to wipe Jesus' feet with her hair. And in the Near East, to show a person your hair would be tantamount to taking off your clothes. It was shameful. It was embarrassing. If a woman had walked into the room while the prostitute had dropped her hair down so that it would be seen to wipe Jesus' feet, the plate would have dropped out of her hand in a gasp of terror at the craziness of what this woman is doing. Now, have you ever been to a party where you're hosting the party and there's an awkward person at the party? You ever been there before? Stressful, isn't it? You try to do everything you can to try and minimize the awkwardness of the person that has arrived, especially if that person wasn't invited. We had 400 people at our wedding. We invited 350, all right? So that gives you a sense of what can happen when awkward people think that they're invited to something that they're not invited to. And this woman is not invited to the Pharisee's home. She should not be within a stone's throw of this man's house. And if you're Simon, you've got to be thinking, what in the world do I do next? Verse 39, now when the Pharisee who had invited him, Jesus, saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she's a sinner. If Jesus is actually a prophet, if he was actually a spiritual man, he would know what in the world is going on, and he would not allow this unclean, disgusting, nasty, terrible woman of the night to even come close to him. He would never let her touch him. Verse 40, and Jesus, answering, said to him, Simon, because Jesus isn't just a prophet, he's God, and he knows what people are thinking. Jesus says to Simon, Simon, I have something to say to you. And Simon, in the middle of this room with some of his close friends and the religious elites and this prostitute who everyone is blown away, is even in the room, disgusted by her presence, Simon says, I guess this is the moment where I say it, teacher. And then Jesus tells a story. He says, a certain moneylender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii. A denarii was 1 day's worth of wages. So one person owed about a year and a half worth of work to the moneylender, and the other 50. Jesus continues, when they could not pay the moneylender, he canceled the debt of both. Jesus looks at Simon. The room is silent. People are paying attention to this moment. The woman is probably cowering in the corner, eyes down to the ground, not making eye contact with anyone. And he says this to Simon, now which of them, 50 or 500, Simon, which of them will love him more? Now, Jesus is asking Simon, a varsity Pharisee, a varsity religious guy, a kindergarten question. Everyone knows the answer to this question. So Simon answered, the one, I suppose, being sarcastic. Obviously, he knows the answer. The one, I suppose, for whom he canceled the larger debt. And Jesus said to him, you have judged rightly. And in that moment, everyone's kind of looking at Jesus thinking, what in the world is the purpose and the point that this guy is trying to make? And then Jesus would turn to this woman. I want you to imagine this. Jesus is looking at Simon, and now he turns and he makes eye contact with the woman. Everyone else in the room is looking at him, looking at her. And he says to Simon, do you see this woman? Simon, do you see her dignity? Do you see her humanity? Do you see her value? Do you see her worth? Simon, do you even see her? Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. And Jesus, speaking to Simon, and everyone in the room would have understood what Jesus is saying by talking about water and a kiss and oil, because all of these things, water was for washing, a kiss was for greeting, and oil was for cleaning. These were all the minimum signs of hospitality in Jewish culture. That whenever you invited a guest to your home, because they had nasty, what we call today, Jesus sandals on, because they had those sandals on, and because they walked on the same roads that horses walked on, or cattle walked on, and livestock walked on, because that livestock feces would mix in with the dirt of the ground and the water that was there, and there was no way to protect the feet. Feet were stinky, nasty, and smelly. And so the first thing you would do whenever a guest would come to your home is you would make sure that you either washed their feet for them as a sign of service, or at the very least, you left a bowl of water for them to wash their own feet. You would at least give them a kiss of greeting, acknowledging the fact that they were present and there, and that they at least were someone you wanted to have around. And you would give them oil to help them freshen up and clean up before you ever invited them to the table. And the Pharisee, Simon, doesn't do any of these things for Jesus. He doesn't give him water. He doesn't give him a kiss. He doesn't give him oil. He invites Jesus to the table, not because he's interested in honoring Jesus, but because he's interested in getting what he can to make a case against it. Because here's the thing for Simon. Jesus wasn't worth his time. Jesus wasn't worth his hospitality. Jesus wasn't worth his energy to be gracious and kind. Jesus wasn't worth the bare minimum signs of hospitality in Jewish culture. I want to hit pause in this story, because I think when I look at the story of Simon and the prostitute, the Pharisee and the prostitute, I can see myself in both of them. But it's so easy for me to look at Simon and think Simon is the villain And who likes to associate with the villain in the story, right? Like, most of us don't. But I want to ask you this question. It's the question for today. What is Jesus worth to you? I mean, honestly, what is Jesus worth to you? We know what Jesus was worth to Simon the Pharisee. He wasn't worth much. And oftentimes I think we compare ourselves against the Pharisees and say, well, if Jesus ever showed up in my house, I would surely take his shoes off for him and wash his feet, right? If Jesus showed up in my house, I'd make sure that he had the honored seat at the table. If Jesus showed up at my house, goodness, I'd make sure that he got the first and the best cut of the meat, right? You would think those are the things we would naturally do, but so oftentimes we compare ourselves against the worst version and make sure that we feel better than that instead of comparing ourselves against the better one. And so I don't want us to compare ourselves today against Simon the Pharisee. I want to compare us. I want to compare us against the prostitute. Because the prostitute, the woman who has no value, no merit, no worth, the woman who has given her body to men for years and years and years and years and years and years, the prostitute is going to be the one who teaches us what Jesus is worth. What was Jesus worth to the prostitute? I want to give you two things. Jesus was worthy of her best. Write that down in your notes. Jesus was worthy of her best. You see the alabaster jar that she had with that oil in it? Alabaster jars were expensive containers that held perfume and could only be used once. Alabaster was either mined in Egypt and shipped to Israel. Some say that it was mined in Israel as well. It was a marble-like material. It was incredibly expensive, and it held the pungent perfume inside of it. And we don't know how this woman got her hands on the alabaster jar. Maybe it was a client who liked her who gave it to her as payment. Maybe it was the one thing that she was able to take from her father's home before he left that she held as a keepsake. Maybe it was something she had saved all her money up for the special occasion when maybe one day a man would look at her as more than an object and she might be able to wear it on her wedding day. I don't know what her hope was, but we know that this for her was the most valuable thing that she owned. And in a moment, she breaks it open and wastes all of it on the feet of Jesus, the rebel rabbi. Because here's the thing. You and I, we give our best to the people and the things we value most. I mean, I never thought in a million years that I would spend as much money as I do on things for my kids. You ever had that moment? Right? You get another doctor's copay and you think, man, kids are expensive, right? You look at how much it costs for them to do cheerleading practice, to watch them watch other kids play sports, and you think, my goodness, how many uniforms do I have to buy? Why are pom-poms $75? Like, I could have bought a new home by now with all the stuff that my kids cost me. But I value them. And I love them. And as a result of that, I give my best to them. I value my wife. She costs me a lot of money too. But I love her. If we're honest, okay, just be honest. We give our time and our treasure to the things we value the most. Our calendar and our credit card statement tell us what we value most. And if someone were to have access to your credit card statement, if someone other than you would have access to your calendar, someone who didn't know you, what would they say you value most? We know, looking at the life of this woman, this prostitute, that she was willing to waste the best things she had on the one she valued most. I want to ask you this question today, because oftentimes we say, I don't have enough time as an excuse. I don't have enough time is not an excuse. I don't have enough money is not an excuse. I don't have enough time and money is simply a reflection of what we value most. So here's the question, does Jesus get my best? Confession, Jesus doesn't always get my best. Sometimes I'm way too quick to flip to Facebook than I am to my Bible app. Sometimes I'm way too quick to binge watch a show on Netflix than I am to pick up the phone and call a friend in Christian community and see how they're doing. But let's be honest. Does Jesus get my best? Second thing, Jesus was worthy, and this is probably the most important one for us, Jesus was worthy of her reputation. I mean, I don't think we can begin to fathom or imagine just how ridiculously embarrassing it would have been for her to let down her hair in front of those religious men. And you might be saying, well, she's a prostitute, right? Isn't that more embarrassing? No, because in Jewish culture, even if you were a prostitute, you would not show your hair in public. It was the cultural value. It was the baseline reality. It was some semblance or sign of decency. Any form of decency would say, you don't show your hair, because a woman kept their hair hidden as a sign of their dignity and personal self-respect. And in that moment, as she lets down her hair in that culture, she's letting down her personal self-respect and her dignity. She's laying it all down. There's a story in the Old Testament, in 2 Samuel, of King David. And King David is a man who was after God's own heart. And he's got the ark, which is this kind of representation of the presence of God in the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible. And he's bringing the ark back into the city of David. And as he's bringing back the ark into the city of David, God's presence with him. It says this: as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, this is one of his wives, looks out the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord. And she despised him in her heart. Why? Because women were the only ones that were allowed to dance in religious ceremonies. David is wearing a linen ephod, which is a very light material. He's a king, he's stately, he's powerful, he's got a reputation. And David, with 30,000 people around him, is jumping up and down like a fool, making a big deal about his God and the presence of God, and he's losing his reputation. It would be like him running around in boxers today, jumping up and down, honoring his God. And so his wife, rightfully so in some ways, right, is embarrassed by the king in front of 30,000 people, leaping and dancing, doing what only a woman ought to do with half of his clothes on. And when David arrives to his house, he's got an interesting conversation with his wife. Wives, have you ever seen your husband do something dumb and you think, how are we going to talk about this, right? Don't look at him right now. Verse 20. But Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, how the king of Israel has distinguished himself. This is what you call old century passive-aggressive behavior. How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked, in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would. Where is your reputation, David? Do you not have any dignity? Verse 21, David said to Michal, it was before the Lord, who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house, when he appointed me ruler of the Lord's people Israel, that I will celebrate. Michal, I used to be a shepherd boy with no hope in my life, and God turned a shepherd boy into a king. Do you know how far God has taken me? Oh, I will make a big deal about him any time I get the opportunity. I will celebrate before the Lord. Verse 22, I will become even more undignified than this, and I'll be humiliated in my own eyes. Michal, you thought that was humiliating? Let me tell you, I'm willing to go even further than that if that means giving glory and honor and credit and praise to my Heavenly Father, because I don't care about my reputation. I don't care about my reputation. I care about my God and what he's done. David, in front of 30,000 people, would dance in a linen ephod because he was so in love with his God. And the prostitute will let down her hair in front of people who she knew who she was, that she would have to see the next day in the city, that she would have to see the following week in the city, that everyone would talk about the scandal of the woman who let her hair down in the religious man's house, and she would have to live with that reality every single day, but her eyes were so fixed on Jesus, she did not care what anyone else thought. You know, I think some of us struggle to lift our hands when God is inviting us to do that because we're worried about what the people around us are going to think. When the prostitute was willing to let down her hair. Some of us struggle to let our reputation go, our sense of cool, our sense of we've got it all together, our sense of we're all put together. And in so doing, we lose the opportunity to minister to our Heavenly Father. Let me ask you this question. Do I let my hair down before God and others? Do you let your hair down before God and others? Are you unashamed in your worship and praise of Him? Are you unashamed in your love and adoration of Him? Because the prostitute realized something that the Pharisee couldn't. The prostitute realized something that the Pharisee wouldn't. And it's our Jesus is statement today. That Jesus is worthy. He's worthy of our best. He's worthy of our worship. He's worthy of us letting our reputation go for His sake and His glory. He's worthy of every ounce of it. Which begs this question. Why? Why is Jesus worthy? Well, the text continues in verse 47. Therefore, I tell you, Jesus says, her sins, which are many. Stop right there. Jesus doesn't say that she has an alternative lifestyle. Jesus doesn't say that it's okay what she's done. Jesus doesn't give her a pass. He acknowledges the weight of her sin and what she has done in her life. And that regardless of the circumstance or situation that she was in, she's still actively participating in a way of life that is counter to the heart and the nature of God. He says, I tell you, her sins, which are many, are, and here's the word, here's the reason why, forgiven. She's forgiven. For she loved much, but he who is forgiven little loves little. And I want to stop here just for a minute because there can be a mistake we make by thinking in some ways that the love that she showed Jesus is the reason why she's forgiven, and that could not be further from the truth. The love that she shows Jesus is a response to the fact that she's been forgiven. The Greek here shows that the word for forgiveness is actually in the past tense, meaning that most scholars agree that Jesus probably had an interaction with this prostitute at a different time earlier on in the story. He had already forgiven her sins, and out of the overflow of realizing how much she had been forgiven, she had to go find Jesus. She had to go give the best thing that she had. She had to bring it to him because he was worthy of it. And Jesus throws this little line in that I think we can miss, but I think is so important. He who is forgiven little loves little, because look, little forgiveness leads to little love. If you think you've been forgiven a little bit, then you're not going to love God a lot of it. So let me ask you this. Are we $50 sinners or $500 ones? You know, I was thinking about this because it's tax season. And it's also bill season, right? And so you get all your Christmas card shopping, all your Christmas shopping, you get that bill in January, right? And then there's that reality. And I began thinking about this. Imagine if you could, that there was a bill statement that was sent to your house every single month. And it was a ledger of all of the ways that you had messed up in the month of January. Like it listed every single thing. The time that you did the thing that you shouldn't have done. The time you didn't do the thing that you should have done. The time that you said that you were going to pray and then you didn't pray for the person you said you were going to pray for, right? The time that you said, I'm going to pray for that person, but you really use that prayer as that prayer request as an opportunity to gossip about somebody, right? The time when you didn't turn your eyes when you know that you should have turned your eyes. The time when you didn't give a person dignity when you should have given them dignity. The time when you lied or cheated to your spouse and it was a small lie, but it felt like a lie and you just kind of passed it under underneath the bridge. Imagine if you just got last month's ledger, the amount of times that you sinned. Now imagine that the reason why you got that letter is because your address had finally been corrected. And for however long you've been living, maybe you're 30 years old, for 360 months, you had been receiving these letters in the mail, but they were going to a different address, and heaven figured out where you actually live now, and they've now sent you all of that backlog of the last 360 months of your life in the places where you were a debtor and you owed. Do you think you'd be a $50 sinner or a $500 one? I think I'd be a $5 billion one, maybe more. Because I know me, and I know the things that I think that I don't even say, and that alone would be a long list. I know the things that I feel that lead to anger and outbursts towards people I care about. I know the times that I've chosen myself over the people that I love. I know the times that I've seen someone in need and chosen not to help them because I just didn't feel like it. I know all or don't even know. I don't even know all of the times that I have chosen my own way instead of God's. And the difference between the Pharisee and the prostitute was not their closeness to Jesus. He was in the room with them. The difference between the Pharisee and the prostitute was not their ability to connect with Jesus. Jesus was willing to go to the Pharisee's house. The difference was the Pharisee did not see himself in need of saving. And the prostitute, man, she knew. She knew. Have you been forgiven a little bit or a lot? Verse 48, Jesus said, and he said to her, your sins are forgiven. They've been forgiven. Not because you poured perfume out on my feet, not because you covered my feet with your tears, not because you showed up at this house. Your sins are forgiven because I'm a good money lender who cancels all the debts of the people that owe me. Your sins have been forgiven not because of anything you've done, but because of how good I am, because I've made the choice and decision to choose to forgive. I have made the choice and decision to absorb what you owe and pay it myself. And in that minute, and in that moment, the people around Jesus are so appalled by what they're seeing that they would say in verse 49, the men at the table, who is this? Who is this who even forgives sins? He's the promised one that God said would come and live the life we cannot live, die the death that we deserve, and defeat death on our behalf. And Jesus, in the middle of this situation, looks at the woman as an exclamation point to everything he's just talked about. And he says to her, your faith has saved you. Not your good works, not your good merit, not what you just did in this moment, but your faith, your trust and your confidence in me has saved you. Go in peace. You see, because here's what I'm learning about life, is that our worship, our praise, our giving God our best, our giving God our reputation and not caring what people think about us, all of those things are simply a response. Worship is a response. It's a response to realizing how much we've been forgiven. And if I'm honest, part of my struggle with those of us that live in Lake Nona is that it's way too easy to be like Simon the Pharisee. It's way too easy to see ourselves as $50 sinners instead of $500 ones because we're in vocational ministry, because our kids are being raised in a great home, because we've studied or learned or been in church our whole life, because we have a religious background. And I want you to understand that the religious arrogance was the thing that blinded the Pharisee to his need for Jesus. Worship is a response. Because our faith, our hope, is not in our effort or in our earning, but it's in faith alone, by God's grace alone, through Jesus alone. So Jesus walks into the Pharisee's house. And the question in front of all of us is, what would you do if Jesus walked into the room? We would like to think that we would be like the prostitute and worship our King. But here's what I know, is that what we do now is practice for what we would do then. Because God's presence is right here with us. He didn't leave us after he ascended into heaven with no hope. He sent us the Holy Spirit, the very presence of God that lives inside of you if you're a follower of God and resides in this room as we gather together. And I think the reason why we struggle to worship, I think the reason why we struggle to give God our best and lay down our reputation is we don't know how much we have been saved from. Jesus is worthy.